Are you familiar with the phrase genetic fallacy? Anybody know what that is? Okay, I didn't either when I came across this, and I thought, what in the world is that? I gotta look this up. So I did, and I found this definition. It's a misconception of information that is either dismissed or validated based solely on the source that it came from rather than the content. So in other words, someone basically gives you information, okay? They give you information and you either discount it or you give it credibility based on the source instead of the actual merit of the information. Make sense? Got it? I'll give you an example. So let's say I came in here today and I said, I heard this morning a report on CNN. And as soon as I say that, a number of people are going to say, shut you out, I don't even want to hear it because of the source, right? They're going to totally close it down. If I came in and said, well, I heard a report on Fox News, others may say, okay, well, I'll tune in now because of the source, right? So we pick and choose who we want to listen to, who we want to actually believe or misconcept, or who we actually want to discount or give credibility based on the source. And it's easy to discount information based on the source rather than the merits of the information. But what I want to talk about in particular today is advice. Advice should be judged on its merit, not on its source. There's a difference. We'll talk more into things that we should definitely dismiss later, but if you don't pay attention to how your advice, or let me say this again, if you don't pay attention to how we judge our advice, if it's based on the source or the merit of the advice, you just might become your own worst enemy. Today we are wrapping up this series. We're on week 3 of how not to be your own worst enemy. We have all been our own worst enemy, right? At some time or another. In many cases, we can laugh about those seasons. We can look back and say, oh, that was terrible, but it's funny now. But there are times where it just is not funny, is it? There are times that we have blown it up big. Maybe it's been our career that we ruined. Maybe it's been a marriage. Maybe it's been our finances. Maybe it's been our health. Who knows? Doesn't matter. Yet you see other people and we think, well, I would just never do that. They might be blowing up their life, but I would never let that happen to me. But yet each and every one of us have the potential to be our own worst enemy if we are not careful. Now, I said this previously, a single bad decision is always the first step to becoming your own worst enemy. And I gave you this great line here. Every habit begins with the first step. Every pattern begins with the first line, and every journey begins with the first step. I said the first time. You get where I'm going, right? Every habit begins with the first time, right? Every habit begins with the first time. So in this series, we're talking about 3 preventative habits that you can start today in order to help prevent yourself from becoming your own worst enemy. Now, you may be wondering, why in the world are we talking about this in church? Does this really belong in church? Sounds more like a TED Talk, doesn't it? Or something maybe that should be at a business seminar or even a counseling session. But the reason we're talking about this in church is because this whole idea of not becoming your own worst enemy has more to do with than just you. When you become your own worst enemy, when you blow up your finances, your marriage, whatever it is, you are not the only person affected. You are not the only person that it hurts. You are not the only person who feels impacted by it. In fact, the sharpnel from all of our bad decisions, from becoming our own worst enemy, hits everyone around us, but especially the people closest to us, the people that we love, right? So let's have a quick review of what we've been talking about. First week we talked about paying attention to the tension. So when you're considering an option, an invitation, ask yourself, is there a tension that I should be paying attention to? Is there a tension that deserves my attention? If something about the decision dings your conscience, and it doesn't matter if everybody else is doing it, if it's bothering you, let it bother you. Don't start selling yourself on it. You never have to sell yourself on the right thing. You never have to sell yourself on something good. And last week, we said pay attention to your narrative. Okay, these are the things we tell ourselves on the inside, right? And these are the ideas that we think we have. Pay attention to how your reactions, your responses, your feelings, how you frame all of that. Pay attention to the things you tell yourself. Our internal narratives can be so helpful, but they can also be so damaging. And we've got to pay attention to them. If you missed last week, I'm just going to plug this in right now. I encourage you to go to our website, yorkspringsumc.org. That's all it is, yorkspringsumc.org. Go to the website or go to our YouTube channel and watch it. It's a topic that I feel like we don't talk enough about, and you probably won't hear a lot about, but it's a topic that is very, very foundational to having a positive life, especially as Christ followers. So today, pay attention to the voices of wisdom around you. That's the habit number 3. Pay attention to the voices of wisdom around you. Now, most people who become their own worst enemy, and I would argue to say all people who become their own worst enemy, are warned beforehand. If you think back hard enough, you know every time you were your own worst enemy, you were warned about it. Somebody said to you, I'm not so sure about him. I'm not so sure about her. I'm not really keen on that idea over there, or I don't know about that job, or I don't know about that investment. Someone tried to warn you. They felt the tension that we ignored. They were connecting the dots that we didn't, and they said something. But because of your internal narrative, or because you had already made up your mind, a lot of us are stubborn, aren't we, once we make up our mind, you didn't listen. You didn't want to listen. For some reason, even though we know this, we know that paying attention to the voices of wisdom around you is such a critical habit to have, yet it is so difficult to do. So difficult to do. So today, I want to read to you or share with you a story from the Old Testament. It comes from 1 Kings. It's not a very well-known story. In fact, you might not recognize any of the characters unless you've really read and dug into this chapter yourself. But it's found in 1 Kings, and it revolves around Israel's 4th king. Now, let me just give you a little bit of insight here, because we've talked about some of these guys over the last couple of weeks. So King Saul was Israel's 1st king, and then along came David, and then David's son Solomon, and then it's expected that Solomon's son would be next, right? That makes sense, okay? So that would be King, get this name here, Rehoboam, okay? So we're going to talk a lot more about Rehoboam today, but there's another character I have to introduce to you before we get this story started so that this all starts to make sense. And I'm just going to put his name up here because it's Jeroboam. Don't mix them up. Rehoboam, Jeroboam. Rehoboam, I said it wrong the first time. Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Rehoboam, Jeroboam. You know how many times I had to practice that before today? I'm just going to put that out there because it becomes a tongue twister after a while when you're talking about these two guys. But anyways. So the assumption was that after Solomon died, Rehoboam would take the throne of Israel. And now to fully understand this story, I want to give you a little bit of back history, okay? Because by this season in King Solomon's life, he's the current king at this point of the story, he was building so many buildings, so many monuments, that he had over 150,000 stoneworkers and transporters working on these huge and massive building projects. That was just about the entire male available population in that area, 150,000 of them. And it wasn't so much paid labor as it was forced labor. Now, Jeroboam, he comes into the picture because he's this very well-liked guy. He's very respected. He's pretty popular. People know him. People like him. He's a hard worker. And when Solomon saw how hard of a worker this young man was, he decided that he was going to put him in charge of his entire workforce. So this would have been a very huge, influential position in the kingdom. And so one day, Jeroboam is leaving Jerusalem. He's walking outside of town, and something very odd happens to him. There's a prophet named Ahijah. That's what I said, Ahijah, not Elijah. Don't get them mixed up. Ahijah was a prophet. Now, a prophet is someone who God speaks to and gives messages to for the people, right? So he is the guy who delivers God's messages. And he meets up with Jeroboam outside of Jerusalem. Now, it was just the two of them out there. Nobody else is around. And the prophet walks up to him, takes off his brand new coat, and starts ripping it to pieces. Doesn't say anything, just rips it and rips it and rips it into 12 pieces, and eventually hands 10 of those to Jeroboam and says, "This is what the Lord God says to you. I'm going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hands, and I am going to give you 10 of the tribes." Now, as you may remember, Israel was made up of 12 tribes, okay? He says that King Solomon is going to lose 10 of those, and he's going to give those to Jeroboam to be king over. Why? Well, at this time in history, Solomon, King Solomon, really was a pagan. And the reason I say that is because the definition of a pagan is someone who worships multiple gods. And that's exactly what King Solomon was doing at this time. Now, knowing that he is known as the man who is the wisest to ever live, there's a whole story behind that, and we'll get into that some other week, but he made a lot of bad decisions. Started with marrying all these different wives. He had wife after wife after wife. In fact, there was just way too many to count. And all of these wives from different areas, and they had different faiths, and they had different gods, and he took them all on. In fact, many of these new constructions were temples and places of worship for all of these gods, which was absolutely against what God had told Israel to do. So by this time, Solomon has abandoned his faith, and consequently, King Solomon is treating his subjects like they are pagans, like the pagans often did, pagan kings that is at least, and he was treating his subjects as slaves. So the prophet says, you know what, God is fed up with this. He is done. He is tired of this. When King Solomon dies, things are going to change. Things are going to be divided. Jeroboam, you will get 10 of the tribes, and for the sake of David, I'm going to leave 2 of them with Solomon's dynasty because I promised David that there would always be, right, a king from his line. I'm going to leave 2 tribes with Solomon, but other than that, the other 10 are gone. Now, apparently, Jeroboam was either really excited about this or really nervous about this. I'm not sure which one, but he couldn't keep it to himself. He could not keep this prophecy over him to himself, so he tells somebody. They eventually tell somebody, and they tell somebody, and they tell somebody. Eventually, word gets back to King Solomon. And you know what King Solomon did? He did what any of the ancient kings did when there was a threat through the dynasty. He wanted to kill Jeroboam, and he tried. But Jeroboam escaped and headed off to Egypt. Don't ask me why, but Egypt apparently is the place to hide, right? We hear that more and more in the Bible, right? So he heads off to Egypt. He hides there until Solomon dies. Now, this is where the story gets really interesting, and this is where we're really going to start to jump into the story. Solomon dies, and the assumption is that the kingdom, is going to get passed off to his son, Rehoboam. Did I say that right? Yeah. Rehoboam. Yeah, I said it right. I'm telling you, it's a tongue twister. And it's expected that there aren't going to be any challengers, that it's going to be all his. But when Jeroboam heard that King Solomon is dead, he's like, you know, finally, I can go home. And he starts to head back. And as he starts to head back, the people of Israel hear that he's coming back. And they send for him. They send for him because, first off, he's still a very well-respected person. He's still somebody that they all like and that they trust. But they have an idea. They have an idea. He, Jeroboam, and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. Your father, like other kings, treated us like slaves. But now we want you to do something different, is what they're saying. We want you to do something different. And if you do this, we will serve you wholeheartedly for the rest of your life. We will serve you willingly, freely. But you've got to stop with all this crazy construction. You've got to stop with all the heavy taxing. You've got to stop taking our men to these faraway places to drag all these heavy stones and come back to build yourself some temples or for your God. You've got to stop all of that. And at this point, Rehoboam makes 2 really good decisions. I'm very proud of him. He makes 2 really good decisions. The first one, Rehoboam answered, go away for 3 days and then come back to me. So the people went away. Now, this is wise. This is a really wise decision because he's saying basically, let me think about it, okay? Let me get this all in check. Let me just think about this. Hopefully pray about it. That's probably not the case, right? But let me think about this at least. And then he goes on and makes a second wise decision. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. So he goes to the elders who are older men, who are wiser men than he. They're people who have been around the block for a while. They were there with Solomon. They helped Solomon all of these years. They have a perspective. So these are good guys to go to for advice. And he says, how would you advise me to answer these people? They replied, if today, not tomorrow, not next month, not next year, but today, you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. You want to be a king of a united kingdom? Then this is what you need to do. You need to put their interest ahead of yours. That was very wise counsel. That was very good leadership instruction. These guys know what they're talking about. But Rehoboam thought, well, we might be tempted to think, they're old guys. What do they know, right? They're not in my shoes. They don't know what they're talking about. And he discounted their good advice because of where the advice came from. This is what he needed to hear. This was the way to get what he wanted, but this is not what he wanted to do. There are very likely people in your life right now who have the advice that you need to get to where you need to be, or where you even want to be. And you may be discounting their advice because of who they are. And you may think, they don't know what they're talking about. They're not in my shoes. They haven't lived what I lived. You could give 1,000 reasons to discount their advice. And obviously, there's advice that we should always discount, right? There is advice that we should discount. But that's where we do this full circle and we come back to the first thing we talked about in this series. Pay attention to the tension. If there's tension, if it doesn't feel right, if your conscience is being hit and something is saying this is not right, then pay attention to that. But as for the positive advice that you know is positive, whose advice are you currently ignoring? Whose advice are you currently ignoring? And then here's what makes this an even more powerful question. What is the internal narrative that you're using to reinforce your resistance to their advice? What's your internal narrative? Because when you pay attention to that narrative, it's going to be another indicator as to whether or not you are resisting good or bad advice. And if there's something in you that says, well, what could they possibly know? Then you need to hit pause. You need to hit pause right there. Just stop right there and evaluate all of this and evaluate your narrative and evaluate the tension, because you just might become your own worst enemy if you don't. There's a time to be cautious about bad advice, but what I'm saying here today is be careful that you don't discount good information, or more particularly good and powerful, important advice because of the source, okay? So for Rehoboam, he wanted a united kingdom, right? He wanted all of that, but he didn't want to listen. So you know what he did? He did what we do. He found somebody who would tell him what he wanted to hear. But Rehoboam rejected the advice of the elders and the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him, okay? So surround yourself with people who will tell you what you want to hear, and you will definitely become your own worst enemy. It's that simple. It's just that simple. In fact, let's add a layer. Surround yourself with people who need you or want something from you, who will only tell you what you want to hear, and they will surely help you to become your own worst enemy. These people were serving him, okay? They had a job to do. They were going to tell him whatever he wanted to hear. They were never going to be honest with him. That's why we all have to be proactive to bring people of good influence in and around us, and then give them the opportunities to influence us and give us that good advice. As life goes on and you become more and more successful, you're going to have more and more people around you who want something from you or need something from you, and they're the people who are likely going to tell you whatever you want to hear. And in this case, Rehoboam chose to listen to the men who needed him, who wanted something from him, who had no more life experience and insight than he did. And he asked them, what's your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, lighten the yoke of your father that your father put on us? The young men who had grown up with him replied, these people have said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make your yoke lighter. Now tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions. Now, let me give you a little idea of what some of this means and what they're saying. In this culture, it was a sign of wealth and health to be large. And that was because most people were living on the verge of starvation. Solomon, he was a pretty large guy. He had a pretty big waist, in other words. So Rehoboam would be saying to them, you ain't seen nothing yet. You think my father was bad? Well, my pinky, my little finger is a whole lot bigger than my father's waist, right? And a scorpion You might think that's a bug, but that's not what this was talking about. This was a type of whip. It was made out of metal, it was made out of bones, and it was used to punish criminals. Criminals, okay? So Rehoboam's message would be, my father treated you like slaves, but I'm going to treat you even harsher. I'm going to treat you all like criminals. So 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam. The king answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice given to him by the elders. He followed the advice of the young men, and he told them exactly what he had planned and what they suggested. Now, at the moment that he rejected the elders' advice, at the moment that he announced what he was going to be doing, he sealed his fate. And he sealed the nation's fate. A series of unwise decisions would lead to a catastrophic decision that would impact tens of thousands of people. The people of Israel showed up, and they were wise because they were prepared. They had a good feeling that this is the way it would go. And so they came with this prepared statement that was a well-known quote that a rebel back in David's day actually said when he was rebelling against David. This is the quote. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, what share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David. So with this old script, they're saying a couple of things. First and foremost, we're not talking just about a couple of people here out of Israel. We are talking about the entire nation, okay? They are talking to David's relative, and they're saying, Israelites, we'll go to the tents. We'll live outside the city. We will go. We're fine with that. But then you can build your own palaces. You can build your own temples. You can do all that stuff in your own because we're not doing it. We no longer see you as our king. We do not see you as the right to rule over us. That was how strong and powerful this message was. So Rehoboam apparently doesn't believe that the people will rebel. He, I guess, thinks if you just give them some time, they'll get over it, right? So he makes another terrible decision. He sent out to the people the man who was now in charge of the forced labor to put them all back to work. How well do you think that went over? The author of the scripture says, all of Israel stoned him to death, meaning that all of Israel stood behind this. All of Israel were putting their foot down and saying, we are not going to be doing this for you. You are not our king. It's as if they were saying you had the opportunity to rule a united kingdom for as long as you lived, but because it's all about you, and because you wouldn't take that wise counsel from the elders, because you know what do old guys know, then this is how it's going to be. The author says, so Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. 10 tribes of Israel in rebellion to the house of David, and the kingdom never came back together. You know, when a kingdom is divided, it's weakened. And when it's weakened, it's then vulnerable. And when it's vulnerable, it's then invadable. Just like you, just like me, when we don't listen to the wise counsel around us, when we don't listen and pay attention to the voices of wisdom around us. You've heard this before, and I would bet to say you've even given this advice to somebody. So I'm going to throw it back at you today. Find someone who has nothing to gain and who has nothing to lose by telling you the truth. Find someone and ask them, what would you do if you were in my shoes? What would you do? You don't just sell yourself on this idea. You know this is the best approach. You know this. The question is, why don't we ask this question, or why won't we ask this question? And I can at least come up with 3 reasons why we don't or we won't. One is because we already know the answer, all right? And when you already know the answer, why ask the question? You don't need to ask the question if you already know the answer. But if you already know the answer, why aren't you doing it? All right? That's the next question. So then do it. And if you're hesitant on doing what you know is right, then ask the question anyways. Because you know what that does? It gives you affirmation, and it gives us accountability. It actually holds us accountable. Another reason is sometimes we just don't think it's anyone else's business, right? And it may not be anybody else's business, but this is a time and a place where you need to make it somebody else's business, and I'll tell you why. Private decisions have public consequences. Many private decisions have public consequences, don't they? It'll come out sometime or later. I remember many years ago when I ran into a situation in my life where I knew I needed to invite somebody in. I knew it was time. I didn't want to. I was embarrassed. I didn't want to tell them what was going on. I didn't want to talk about that with anybody else. I didn't think it was their business. But yet I remember it dawned on me one day And I thought, you know what? This right now, the situation I'm in is like an itty bitty monster. But it's an itty bitty monster that could literally grow to be this huge monster that would literally devour my life. And if it completely devours my life, well, then everybody's going to know anyways, right? So why not bring in somebody now while it's still small, somebody I could trust, somebody who cared about me, that could help me with this small thing? And you know what? It was embarrassing. It was extremely embarrassing to talk about it. And no, it wasn't anybody else's business. But wise people make it someone else's business for the sake of their future, and more importantly, for the sake of the people around them's future. Another reason we don't ask the question, what would you do if you were in my shoes, is simply because of our ego. Success is intoxicating, and look, I'm just going to burst your bubble now. Success does not make you smarter. In fact, a lot of times success can make us even more clueless or make us even more careless. But here's the thing. Someone else sees what you can't see. Someone is connecting the dots that you are not connecting, and they are not distracted by your internal narratives. So pay attention to the voices of wisdom around you, because wise voices set you up for wise choices, okay? Every single person who has blown up their life, every single person who has become their own worst enemy, that final decision, that decision that they wish they could just go back and undo, it all started with a series of unwise decisions. And when we surround ourselves and we listen to the voice of wisdom, we make better decisions. We live with a whole lot fewer regrets, and we avoid becoming our own worst enemy. So the challenge for you and the challenge for me today is to look into the mirror and ask ourselves the question, have we fallen into this rut of discounting advice because of the source rather than recognizing the merit of the advice? Remember, the series is not just for your sake. This is as much about the people around you. On the night when Jesus was arrested, he gave us our new covenant marching orders, if you would. And he reduced all his teachings down to one simple imperative. And he said, you are, as my follower, you are to love as I have loved you. You are to love as I have loved you. We, as Jesus followers, cannot love as he has loved us if we are blowing up our lives over selfish, unwise decisions. Because those decisions, other people suffer because of those too. It's not just us. So I hope you will take these 3 preventative habits very seriously. Write them down. There's little note cards in the pews. We'll leave this up for here a moment. But pay attention to the tension. Pay attention to your narrative, and pay attention to the voices of wisdom around you. On the back side of your bulletin, there are questions. I forgot to tell you they were there last week. Hopefully you saw them. If you didn't, go back and look at your bulletin if you still have it. But anyways, these are questions to help you make this personal. These are questions to help you think further about, are you really listening to those wise voices, or are you discrediting them? So read those, share them with your family, share them with your neighbor, share them with a friend, whatever works. But they're great discussion questions to get you started going a little bit deeper on this topic.